I think we'll call the meeting to order, and I want to thank everybody for being here. I'm sorry to impose on your summer schedule, but this is kind of a special meeting, and I think it's an important meeting and something we want to deal with. I'd like to, before we deal with the minutes, I want to go around and have everybody introduce themselves, but before they do that, I want all of you to realize and recognize Krista Rivera today, who's worked with us in the Senate Fiscal Analyst staff. She's going to go over to the Department of Revenue and straighten them out.
Oh.
And
Yay!
so, Krista, we thank you for all your service to the Senate, and I know this is going to be not the last that we'll see of you, but it's going to be a good adventure for you, and so congratulations on your promotion. And
Take your abacus with you because they don't have computers over there, all right? Or at least anything that was built in the last decade.
So let's start with the introductions. Zach, if you would start.
Hello, Zach Jackson, Deputy Budget Director.
Deanna Owari, Deputy Budget Director.
Representative Greg Porter, alternate.
Terry Gooden, State Rep, District 66.
Greg Taylor, State Senate, alternate.
Alicia Nafziger, House Republicans, Fiscal Analyst.
Ben Tooley, House Republican Fiscal Analyst.
Bob Cherry, House Republican.
Jason, Jason Dudich, State Budget Director.
Kim, I would point out. He's on his motorcycle with another person or two, and they're coming back from Yellowstone. He's going to do 4,000 miles on a motorcycle. So when he gets back, you can question his sanity.
David Reynolds, Fiscal Analyst, Senate Republican Caucus.
Karen Talion, State Senate District 4, Senate Democrat.
Susan Preble, Senate Democrat Fiscal Analyst.
Chris Rivera, currently Fiscal Analyst for the Senate.
Currently. The minutes of the last meeting have been distributed. It's been moved that they be approved.
Second.
Second. Can all in favor signify by saying aye?
Aye.
Good. That's a good start to this meeting. And a proposed agenda has been distributed to all the members and released to the public. Are there any amendments to the proposed agenda? Seeing none, we will place the agenda on the table for discussion. And we have a review item. We have Micah Vincent and Dan Hughey from the Governor's Office and the Indiana Finance Authority to give us a review of the I-69 financing structure that's going to be put in place due to the termination of the public-private agreement. And I know that Dan and Micah have worked hard to prepare for this meeting and want to make sure that all of you have an opportunity to have all of your questions answered. Before we proceed on this, I think it's important to set the stage on what this means, what it represents to us here. And in the last 10 years or so, Indiana has been one of the pioneers of trying to develop different ways to do state projects that are the most efficient, not only in terms of their financing costs, but in terms of how you get accountability out of whoever the contractor is and what processes you want to use. And those of you who follow not only around the nation, but across the world know that public-private partnerships are one of the new tools that's being used literally everywhere in the world, and they're probably going to be used more and more. And we have done a few here in Indiana, and some with great success. And in this case, the original program isn't working out, and Micah and Dan have just an explanation for us as to how they're dealing with this. But I think that it's important for us to understand that this is the way of the world, and I think the important thing is that Indiana is ahead of the game, that not only are we not going to lose on this particular deal, but this is going to help us figure out how to do these things in a stronger, better way going forward. So any comments that you have, in addition to questions, are certainly welcome as part of the process of how we do things better. But I think it's important to recognize that the transparency that's taking place by us having a public meeting on this issue and having the full explanation be present. So with that spirit, I'm going to ask Mike Vincent if he would kick us off. And gentlemen, the floor is yours. As you know, committee members may have questions at any moment, so we'll probably interrupt you from time to time. But we appreciate you being here and making the presentation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I thank you for the opportunity to be here to discuss the I-69 Section 5 project and really specifically to talk about the bond issuances that is part of the path to the state taking this project over. And that's really what we're here today to talk about. Certainly we'll look forward to going through the history of the project, some of the financial details, and of course steps that have been taken. A couple thoughts at the beginning. First of all, as Senator Kinley mentioned, Micah Vincent, Director of the Office of Management and Budget for Governor Holcomb for the state of Indiana. With me, Dan Hughey, Public Finance Director, the head of the Indiana Finance Authority. Should also note, in my role, I serve as the chairman of the Indiana Finance Authority. So that's part of the role, and look forward to discussing this with you and walking through the slides here. I'd certainly be remiss, and Senator Kinley, this might lead to harder questions, but I'd be remiss if I didn't, with your announcement yesterday. Thank you for your service, and you know, what a pleasure it's been to work with you. And I know that's the sentiments of so many of us here, and that's probably not me getting favors for this. It'll probably make this harder that I just did that. So I recognize that and willing to take that risk. A couple of thoughts in terms of you know, where we are and certainly why we're here today. Specifically why we're here today is because of provision, and this will be on the next slide, and I'll hit it again, but specifically why we're here today is a provision that was added in House Enrolled Act 1002 in this session. I believe it was, and I'll do this more in detail here in a second, but a specific provision in 1002 was provided so that if we could reach resolution to bring this project back into state-controlled, hand it over to INDOT from an operational perspective, we saw that bonds would be a part of that, and being able to take out the current bonds that the developer put out on the project, work with the bondholders and developer to terminate that deal, and then bring forward and submit to Budget Committee review. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second, but did want to state up front, you know, why specifically statutorily why we are here today is to walk through that and as a requirement of that statute. What we'll talk through here today, we'll go through history of the projects, steps that we took to bring this project to the path of where we are now, and then also some of the financial outcomes. Certainly we could talk in more detail and look forward to your questions. I will say, as just maybe one other point of statement here, is just there's been a lot of work from many parties to get us to where we are today on this project. Parties at Indiana Finance Authority, INDOT, others, and I just want to say thank you to the team that's just been working really hard this summer, and part of that is that we brought this forward to you, and so thank you to you for taking some time out from your summer as well to do this. As Senator Kinley mentioned, you know, P3s are something that we see as more and more part of the menu of options that is being used for road projects around the world. We think it's important that we continue to evaluate and use it where it makes sense. I think there's an evaluation process that needs to be a part of that. The second point, and again, this will be discussed further as we move along, is that while there's been a path to get here, the financial outcomes are pretty reasonable, and we'll talk through that as we get to later slides. One additional, somewhat of an ad lib, is just the process to get here. These mentioned the statutory authority, then the Indiana Finance Authority reached agreement in principle with the bondholders and the developers, separate agreements As Security and Exchange Commission, SEC rules require that as soon as that agreement in principle happens, that it has to be posted to the EMA website. So that's why you saw the announcement a couple weeks ago. As soon as we reached agreement in principle, we went forward and talked about that publicly because it has to be posted publicly at that time under SEC rules. That was pending that agreement in principle was pending IFA action, IFA board action. The Indiana Finance Authority acted last week to adopt that agreement in principle, the terms of that agreement in principle, and then also to authorize the chairman of the Indiana Finance Authority and the public finance director to execute final agreements with bondholders and developer on that. And then the other part of that, process-wise, is part of the plan forward is to issue bonds to take out the previous bonds. We'll talk about that in more detail, and that process needed to be brought to the Budget Committee for review. So with that, I'll jump into that. I obviously tipped the hat of where most of this discussion is going to be, but I did want to just give a little bit of an outline first of just the kinds of things, both the process to get to here and then the kinds of things we're looking at as we go into discussing where we're at on this project. So Indiana Code 8-15.5-5-6.1 A5 and B, when you read them together, require that the issuance of bonds to provide funding to complete the I-69 Section 5 project must be submitted to Budget Committee for review. This legislation was passed in House Enrolled Act 1002, 2017. Again, this is when we saw the state of this project and where things were at with the design builder and developer and working through the process. We looked at what kind of barriers existed for the state to be able to take this project back over and sought this legislation to be able to get us back to state control of this project and where we are today. So that's the statutory requirement of why we're here today, is that the issuance of bonds for a project like this, and obviously this was in our minds when we sought this legislation, was in House Enrolled Act 1002. We also thought it was important that this process mirrored other bond processes and that we would come before the Budget Committee for review. And so that's why we asked for this review as well when we proposed that legislation. Dan's going to talk through the bond issuance that we're working at and what we're looking at in the process and where we are today. So Dan, do you want to start walking through the bond issuance?
Thank you, Micah. Members of the committee. As Micah mentioned, we're coming for you for a review of a bond issue. The first steps we're taking is to issue a bond anticipation note later this month. A bond anticipation note is almost like a bridge loan to get us the financing to be able to pay off the private activity bonds issued by the developer. The use of these bond proceeds allow for the speed of the execution of the settlement documents so that IFA and NDOT can gain a full release from the bondholders and officially take over the project. The proceeds from the bond anticipation note will be used to pay off the outstanding principal of the private activity bonds issued by I-69 Development Partners, approximately $240 million. And then the IFA will then work on a standard fixed rate highway revenue bond issue to take out this bond anticipation note. The plan for the bond issue is to issue hopefully no later than September to do a full bond issue.
Dan, I think Senator Talion has a question.
Sure, Senator.
The 240, that amount represents the outstanding principal, but not any interest that they would have received. So it would be 100%, that's paid off at 100%?
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll pay off the amount of the bonds, and there's an accrued interest payment involved here also.
What would be the interest rate in regards to when you change from 240, the bond application?
The ban, I think right now, we're waiting for this review before we can move forward and enter into a term sheet and so forth. But the estimate right now is somewhere between 1.15% and 1.2%. Correct.
One of the important things of why we're doing it in this process, the bond anticipation note, is seeking the bond anticipation note finalizes the agreements with the developers and bondholders and then allows us to have a close on the current agreements. So I know this isn't your interest question, but just more broadly speaking. It brings it to close, and it allows us to move forward with the standard bond issuances, and that's important both operationally, but then also just as we are able to move forward financially as well. I should have referenced this earlier, meant to. This does not have an impact in where we're at today, but on 2 days ago, on July 4th, the parent company of the design builder, Isilux Corazon, filed bankruptcy in Spain, but that does not affect the USA subsidiary of Isilux. And we've negotiated agreements to be able to move forward with this deal with the USA subsidiary's sign-off. The bankruptcy in Spain won't have an impact here. And then separately, also the money that we're receiving from the developer, none of that is actually coming from the design builder. So all of what we're at with them is that the dissolution of the agreement, but it is important that with the bond anticipation note does allow us to move forward, does allow NDOT to be able to move in and take control of this project, but did want to reference what was going on with the design builder parent company, but then also tell you that we've reached agreements that we will not be impacted by that whatsoever. And then also the financial dealings here, we're not receiving any money from them as part of the settlement agreement.
So we go into the highway road bond issue. Generally, a bond
Dan, Senator Taylor.
Thank you. This question is more for Dan. Dan, I do understand the utilization of the bands to take out the original bonds. So once that happens, does the state of Indiana put its full faith and credit behind the September bond issue I want to talk about?
Absolutely.
Okay, so now I just read today that the U.S. is going to be, the United States Treasury is actually going to be selling a lot of their bonds into the market. Could that push back the September, depending on the what happens there? Is that going to affect us going to market in September?
I don't believe so. We
Okay.
monitor that closely along with our underwriter and financial advisor.
Okay.
And that gets taken into consideration, but we always plan ahead. We get everything ready to go to market, and if there are conditions that aren't appropriate, we wait and issue as soon as possible afterwards.
And just for committee discussion purposes, what would be the spread difference between a triple B rating, which B minus, which is what the bonds are right now, versus what we're going to get because we have the full faith and credit?
The original bonds that were issued by I-69 Development Partners that were rated triple B minus, the interest rate was in the range of about 5%. The bonds we're issuing with AA plus rating of the state of Indiana and the full faith and credit of the state, again, this is current market conditions, probably in the range of 3.5% to 4%. No, it'd be almost 100 basis points.
100 basis points. Thank you.
Moving on to the bond issue, we hope to have that done in September 2017. Bond issue process does take about 60 days to get all the documents put together, move forward, and develop a marketing plan to sell the bonds. The proceeds will be used to pay off the ban first, and then finance the remaining costs for the projects. And I think Senator Taylor did a very good job of already talking about the strength of the AA plus credit of the state of Indiana versus the PABs that were issued at triple B minus. As we noted at the IFA board meeting and others, the state ultimately will save as a small savings compared to the original P3 agreement. We have a slide after that to go into more detail. The main thing we need to emphasize, though, is while there may be a small savings, the state of Indiana and NDOT now accept the risk of O&M and life cycle costs on this 21 miles of road. Thankfully, or appropriately, more than half of the project's done, so some of that risk has already been mitigated and identified.
Yeah, I do think that's an important point. Maybe I'll just highlight that again for a second, is that under this model, there is a slight savings. There's also a slight incurrence of risk. We're probably a little better situated than, from a risk perspective, than because of the amount of the project that's been done up to this point, but that is a different and an important point between the original deal and where we are today. So the next slide, we'll walk through the financials of this agreement and relative to the original terms. So you'll see in the red column is the original agreement, the green is the new agreement. And Dan, do you want to walk through this?
Sure. On the left side of the red column, what we did here was looked at the total costs under the P3 structure that we agreed to. What we looked at here were the availability payments that we were to make over 35 years to the developer for operating the road, maintaining the road, and so forth. The availability payments are utilized by the developer to pay debt service cost on their private activity bonds, operation and maintenance expense, life cycle costs, and a return on equity for their equity contribution to the project. What we did there is we took a net present value of those 35 years of availability payments and put them in today's dollars. In today's dollars, that's about $510 million. The state also committed to make milestone payments during the construction process. Milestone payments are made as the developer hits certain deadlines on getting the road built, and the state committed to making $80 million of milestone payments. So the total cost under the center,
Italian?
Yeah, can you, how much money have we already paid out to them in milestone payments?
57 million?
57 million.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Yep.
So you'll see, Senator Tallien, you'll see on the column there, the 80 million in the column with the red is 80 million is the total that would have been paid out under that original agreement. If you go to the other column, you see the $80 million there. The way we treated it there is that's representative of the 57 that has already been paid, the other 23 that would have been paid. We left it shown this way instead of rolling it up into one of the other costs, just so that we could show apples to apples where the comparison was.
So the 80 million includes the 57 or is in addition to?
Includes.
Includes, got it.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll take a minute. Under your cost assumption, what life of a bond are you planning to float? Are you going to be on a 35-year basis, the same as the original arrangement?
Modeling we've done, and again, this is just modeling, we're looking at a 20-year bond issue as opposed to a 29 or 30-year bond issue.
Well, you get 100 points for that, Dan. I'm really appreciative of that effort. I've always lobbied for trying to structure these bonds as tightly as we can, and in addition, when you come to these infrastructure projects, they should be timed with the lifespan of the original construction work as best as you can.
Absolutely.
And since we're going to be embarking on an incredible road building program in the future, I thought this was a good time maybe to mention that to you all. So
Absolutely.
All
Fully
right.
understood. And the other part about the bond issue, there'll be a 10-year call provision. So if there are excess funds, that we can pay the bonds off early if we'd like to.
even better.
One other thing I did want to make note of in this in this comparison here is you see the availability payments on the red column obviously do include operations and maintenance. You'll see on the right-hand column net present value, operations and maintenance. So we are including those costs in both columns so that we have an apples-to-apples comparison here. Just did want to make reference of that in case you had concerns that it was in one column but not the other column. We include those operations, maintenance, and life cycle costs in both columns here on this slide. Then, anything else on this?
No,
Mr. Representative Porter, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. When I look on number 5, on your slide number 5, I believe, can you explain the budget, state contribution and developer contribution? As it relates to the developer's contribution, which is about 27 million. Is that a letter of credit?
Representative Porter, the talking about the budgeted state contribution, that is basically our milestone payments that we're going to make the $80 million. $57 million has already been put into the project, and the remaining $23 million of that $80 million will be used to continue to build the project. Correct. Basically, we've not paid the developer their last milestone payment, so that's sitting in escrow right now. And when this deal unwinds, we'll be able to use that $23 million as part of the construction costs.
Is any other payment, performance payment bonds being used in this?
The developer contribution of $50 million includes dollars from the developer and the sureties.
Yeah, and that $50 million that you see here was we sought that as part of the negotiations to dissolve the deal. So that $50 million is a payment to the state.
I'd like to point out, so we're getting $50 million from the developer and the surety, and their $40 million of equity is into the project. So there's almost $90 million that have been put in, and they're not going to receive any return on their equity on this project.
Okay, then the next slide walks through just operationally what happens from here, more from a construction standpoint. So obviously we've talked about a financial standpoint. This next slide talks more about a construction standpoint. So Dan, do you want to walk through this and just kind of where we are on an operational, we'll call it operational control. What we're talking about here is what happens from a construction standpoint from here forward.
Sure. IFA has been working diligently with NDOT over the last few months, preparing for state control of this project. Walsh Construction has been retained as a consultant of the IFA at this point in time to work on the project until we receive the financial close of this settlement agreement. Once that financial close is reached, Walsh will serve as the construction manager of this project on behalf of NDOT. NDOT also plans on taking the following actions. They're going to resolve any claims with subcontractors that are related to the developer or the design build firm. That process is already, I'd say we're deep into that process already. The next step would be reviewing the contracts with the subs and negotiating new contracts. We have been in regular contact with the major subs. They have expressed a keen interest to want to continue on this project and work on behalf of the state of Indiana and NDOT. Again, to remind you, once we reach this financial close and unwind the deal, NDOT will then have full responsibility for the O&M and life cycle costs on the project.
So,
Yeah, Walsh Construction is a big, well-known firm up in my neck of the woods. Is this Walsh Construction 2? Is it the same group? Same group.
Thank you, Jim.
Mr. Chairman, and it's good to see that, I guess, Walsh is around. But as we continue to go through this, if we can hit the reset button, trying to get this project 21 miles done.
Yes, sir.
Is there any consideration of women-owned businesses or minority-owned businesses being involved in as we push the reset button again?
Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I think that we always want to be, mindful and attentive to the processes there. I think in this instance, one of the things we sought in moving forward this project, as you say, hitting the reset button, is moving forward with somebody that we've worked with on a similar project to this. This is, am I right in Walsh is involved in Ohio River Bridges?
Correct.
So that was part of the really big keys here was a project that was already midstream, making sure we pretty quickly moved forward with it. But I certainly understand the question and the concern there.
I appreciate that. I just hope that, we be more inclusive as a state, in regards as we move forward. I don't know Walsh's track record, not really, but I just hope that probably something coming from my office, ask for more specifics, because it's always good to say when we consider that, or it's always on our mind, but the outcomes are not there. It's not data-driven.
Sure, I appreciate the question.
Understood.
I learned a lot this past General Assembly, my colleagues about being data-driven, and I know this is data-driven.
Appreciate the question. Thank you.
Senator Taylor.
Yes, just one thing I don't see here on the plans of taking the following the actions, you had to get a lot of easement and control documents in place in order for the partner to be able to develop the roads.
Correct.
In renegotiating the deal, is there going to be an issue with the fact that the easement holder would be the development partner rather than you guys?
The easements were related to the state of Indiana. And
Okay.
NDOT. They are not developers' easements.
All right.
Thank you, Jim.
And just a follow-up question to that, we also changed the law a little bit this past session. Did you guys know about when you obtain an easement, you have to take down a sign or something like that? You guys are taking that into consideration here, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, all right.
So one comment I wanted to make on the operational controls, we talked about it here. There are a couple of different steps in place. So you see kind of the two the slide is almost structured to reflect it. I don't know that this was intentional, but it does sort of reflect it here, is that right now, the part of the process that we're in is the first bullet here, that we're working hand in hand with NDOT, preparing for state control of the project. Walsh has been brought in as a consultant. NDOT has been able to, based upon the agreement in principle, and then that agreement in principle being adopted and becoming the agreement through the IFA board last week, NDOT has been able to step in and directly discuss with the subcontractors. Now, the next step that you see and what's set up on the second series of bullet points here is as we move beyond the financial close, and that's why we're doing one of the reasons why we're doing bond anticipation notice, is that we can bond anticipation note. We'll do a notice of it too. But one reason why we're doing a bond anticipation note is to be able to quickly move into this next section of the bullet points here where NDOT is in full operational control, construction manager in place, and we're able to quickly move forward with the project. The next part here will...
Senator Tyan.
So this, where it says the next part, resolving any claims related to the developer or design builder, do you I would assume that there will be mutual releases on all of this stuff. Do you foresee any outstanding claims after this is done?
It's our goal to make sure that doesn't happen, and that's what we're working on. We've already had negotiations with the big three subcontractors on their claims and are negotiating with them presently.
The next sections here we'll walk through is obviously background that I think that you all know, and certainly that it's been discussed, but we'll talk some about the history of I-69 Section 5, steps that we've taken to be able to get to the actions that we've already discussed. As I think it's important to go back through this for context, then also as we think about processes and things going forward, we're looking at this and walking through it. So we'll talk about two things here: history of I-69 Section 5, the legal structure, and then also talk a little bit more about the steps taken in 2017, although we covered a lot of that earlier in our presentation, but we'll walk through those here.
Thank you, Micah. Wanted to put together a simple flow chart that showed who had contracts with who in this transaction. I think it's important for everyone to understand that. The Indiana Finance Authority, after choosing I-69 Development Partners for the project, entered a contract with I-69 Development Partners. I-69 Development Partners then had a contract with Isolex Coruscant, the design build firm. So just wanted to highlight the Indiana Finance Authority has no contract with Isolex Coruscant. That is with the developer. Next slide.
Sorry.
Real quick history of the procurement process. The procurement process began in 2013. There was a request for qualifications, a statement of qualifications, and then a request for proposal process that was utilized, similar to what we used on Ohio River Bridge project. After reviewing all the data, IFA entered into a public-private partnership agreement with I-69 Development Partners in April 2014. The financial close of this transaction was reached in July 2014. Shortly thereafter, I-69 Development Partners issued the private activity bonds we've discussed previously. This was a conduit issue through the Indiana Finance Authority. These private activity bonds were issued on behalf of I-69 Development Partners, and they were backed by the full faith and credit of I-69 Development Partners and not the state of Indiana. The private activity bonds had no effect on the state's credit rating. Again, the par amount of the bonds is approximately $243 million. I think as Senator Kennelly mentioned, there was a long maturity here. Final maturity is 2046, almost 30 years on these bonds.
You know, I think going forward, it's going to be important that you all kind of do a review and an after-action report for your own internal use about how you make these things work the most effectively. And to me, two of the things that stand out are, number one, we need to have NDOT placed in the process in a way that facilitates what you all have done here. I think it's pretty fortunate that you have such good working relationships that you managed to do this fairly seamlessly. The second thing would be, I think we need to continue not only to analyze if IFA is a conduit or not a conduit, I think we need to look at all of those steps to continue to monitor where the best standing is for us. This is going to be an evolving market on a worldwide basis, and it could be that the best way to do this is going to go through sort of a metamorphosis of finding out how you do this without putting yourself in a position of liability. And the way we did it here, it appears like it's working just fine, but I think that particular element is a key to determining who's going to be holding the bag if things aren't working out right. So I would encourage you to not just draw some conclusions from this, but to recommend that this be an ongoing monitoring process.
Absolutely.
To see what are the best practices and techniques of dealing with these types of issues.
If I may, I think that's a very fair comment. We had a bit of a discussion actually about that last week at the IFA board meeting of just some ongoing discussions and just how do we continue to review, how do we follow what's going on in the market to know what the best practices are. And certainly we've been a leader in this space, and I think we're even as we look at how a situation like this terminates and dissolves, I think that we'll continue to be a leader throughout that, but it is going to be good for us to continue to do those reviews, and I appreciate that thought.
Representative Gooden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to piggyback on what Senator Kenley said as well, and I'm just going to reiterate what I've been screaming about the last 2 or 3 years when it comes to bonds. We all know that bonds, the life cycle of a bond all depends on its interest rate and then the length of the term of the bond. And we also know that the lower performing bonds, the lower the credit rating, the higher the interest rate is going to be for the state to have to pay. And I always say there should be a threshold on who we actually do business with, because this BBB minus group here that we were doing business with, the next rating in the bond system is basically junk bonds. And why would the state of Indiana be doing business with somebody who's basically junk bond status when we laugh about the state of Illinois all the time, and here we're turning around doing business with a company like that? And then also what I think a lot of people are missing is we're saving the state of Indiana $30 million, which it looks like on paper, and I appreciate that. But what I want to know is, and I don't need the answer today, I'm just making a commentary, but how many more millions of dollars could we be saving the state if we had to set a threshold on the bond ratings on who we actually allowed to bid on our projects? And I think that needs to be something you look at, because out of this project, if we look at those numbers as far as interest, I bet you could probably look at over $200 million at least in savings to the state of Indiana we could be spending somewhere else just in bond ratings. And I think that needs to be something we look at. I know we were in a scurry to try to find companies to do it, but you know what, it's probably best just to hold off a little bit and find a company that can do it right instead of running into companies that can't. So just a little commentary there with that. So thank you.
Senator Talion.
Thank you, and this sort of follows up on what Representative Gooden was just saying. All right, so let me just get this right. The developer actually issued these bonds based on their own strength.
I would,
And then, all right, so, but we're paying them off at 100%.
correct.
Why are we paying, what do we get for that? What do we get for the fact that we're paying them off at 100%? Why didn't they take a discount amount on getting out of these?
Sure. So there were, and Dan will talk through this in more detail, there were a number of different financial pieces to that calculation. So there was the straight-up bond piece of that. There are also quite a large number of relief claims that they had filed against the state of Indiana that we resolved as part of this. So, Dan, I believe it was $90 million plus that were claims that they had filed against the state of Indiana that were also released as part of this agreement. So the amount of this is obviously one of the numbers that's part of that calculation of whether or not we're in a strong position financially in this agreement. The other part of that is these claims against the state of Indiana, and then another part of it is the ability to terminate the deal in a time period that was effective both from an operational control perspective, but also from a overall financial perspective. And you'll see in a future slide, but I'll talk about it now, is as we walked through the timeline certainly there was a significant interest in terminating or being able to get out of this agreement as we move through the process here, but it was, as we continue to look at it, the time just wasn't ripe. And I bring all of that up just to kind of give you a flavor of some of the things in discussion. And when the time's not ripe, where you don't have willing partners to dissolve a deal under negotiated terms, then the cost to get out of the deal, and then also the timeline that drives towards actually constructing the project, both become worse for the state of Indiana. And so just realize that's a little bit of an addition to your very specific question, but there just were a number of factors, like the relief claims against the state of Indiana that we got released, like the being able to dissolve this deal in a timely manner without costly litigation and other practices. So those are some comments.
Agreed.
Dan, did you want to go into anything else that I missed?
That was well done.
If I can, thank you for that. If I can just follow up on that then. So in addition to that, we are getting this $50 million payment. And can you explain a little more detail who that's coming from and on behalf of whom?
Sure. That $50 million is being paid to us by I-69 Development Partners and their parent company, Rotus, and the surety companies. There's 4 different surety companies, so a portion of that $50 million is coming from the developer, a portion of it's coming from the surety company, so we get their full, we get their full release on this transaction also.
All right, and the surety companies you're talking about were the performance bond holders?
That's correct.
I think I already advanced the slide forward, so I'm not very good at this.
All right, so we're going to go.
I think we basically have covered what's on this.
Yep.
What's on this slide. So I don't know if. So steps taken in 2017. I'll just hit some high levels here, and obviously a lot of this actually was in the response I just gave to Senator Tallien's question, but certainly. Governor Holcomb and his team, as he was looking to this project in late 2016, early 2017, was very interested and strongly considering what it would look like to terminate and dissolve this arrangement just based upon what was happening from a construction standpoint, and also as we watched what was happening with the financial position, predominantly of the design builder. And it became increasingly clear that additional steps needed to be done to get the project done. And so we considered termination in late 2016 and early 2017 as we closely monitored the situation. But as I mentioned earlier, termination would have led to increased costs through claims and litigation. Parties were still committed to complete Section 5. And we did not yet actually have the statutory framework, obviously, because we sought that statutory framework when later in the session. And so for those reasons, in February of 2017, the IFA entered into a memorandum of understanding with developer and design builder. The purpose was to inject additional capital into the project and resolve the disputes. That was the necessary step at that time period to keep the project going. Again, there were not willing partners at that point in time to dissolve the agreement, and so any kind of move to do that would have been significantly more costly. I mentioned earlier the relief claims that were against the state of Indiana, and then also would have added time to the project. And so because of that, well, actually, before I say that, in March of 2017, after the MOU had been agreed to, IFA became increasingly aware of the design builders' financial problems continuing to worsen and the impact that would have on their ability to fulfill the agreements in the MOU and also their ability to finish this project. What we did at that point as we were watching that, we sought legislative amendments. The amendment that I talked about earlier, 1002, that allowed us to issue highway revenue bonds, to take out the private activity bonds and bring the control of this project back over to the state of Indiana. And obviously that's why we're here before you today. And we had the provision in here to submit this to Budget Committee for review. But again, we saw the process that was happening. We saw the inability for the design builder to fulfill the agreement in the MOU. And as we saw that happening, we sought the legislation to be able to step in and effectively, cost-effectively and operationally effectively step into this project, bring it back into NDOT control, and be able to move forward. The change, big change from February to where we are now, is that because of the increasing financial difficulties, the developer and the bondholders' position on where they stood relative to a negotiated termination had significantly changed, which led us to reach the agreements that we've reached at this point. Dan, do you want to talk a little bit more about kind of the steps being negotiated?
Sure. We are in the process of negotiating a settlement agreement with both the developer and the bondholders, also the design build firm and the sureties, in order to terminate the public-private partnership agreement.
And actually, sorry, Dan, I should set one thing. The verb tenses here are I do want to clarify kind of the IFA process here. The process here is that we reach settlement agreements. Those are, you reach a term sheet agreement of the big terms, you negotiated those out, and then you finalize the documents. And so finalizing those agreements, again, those big terms have been set, and that's good. We're in good process, but that's the reason why the verb tenses are as they are here, is that there is kind of a two-step process. Some of that's driven by the way you have to do disclosures about agreements in principle with the SEC on EMMA, and then it's also just naturally you want to set those terms in stone, and then you negotiate out the very specific individual items that are part of that. But all of that's going well. I did just want to reference just kind of why the verb tenses are this way here.
Yep. In the last bullet point there is IFA and NDOT are planning the necessary steps to control the project, ensure work continues uninterrupted with the goal of completing the project as fast as possible.
Well, I want to thank you for this open and transparent presentation, and also want to thank you for coming to us during the session and being fully agreeable to appear before the Budget Committee as you were trying to resolve this. I know that at that time, it would have been very easy for you to say, well, we really don't know all the ins and outs of this, and we're not sure we want to have to go into the laundry and deal with everything that might be there, but there was never any doubt in your mind that that was the approach that you took, and I appreciated that. Obviously, I think the most important thing out of this is to recognize the sense of transparency we have, the sense of cooperation that you're using between your state agencies. Otherwise, you could have a lot of disagreements or turf battles about who's gets credit or who's at fault. And I think you're doing as well as can be expected. And on the renegotiation, as you know, I talked to you earlier about the point Senator Talion raised about that settlement. And so, and I think it's good that you will commit to the continue and after-action analysis for the benefit of future deals. Clearly, we want you to conclude this with minimal damage, and we want our infrastructure built out and done in a reasonable price. I can't help but think about a parallel experience that they had in Boston a few years back on the Big Dig, where they started out at $2 billion and they ended up paying $13 billion. And certainly you're not putting us in that kind of a position. So with that, other comments, questions from committee members? Yes, Representative Gooden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree. Thank you for coming in and explaining everything, because you could have hit this very easily. You didn't try to do that. So thanks for the transparency. I do want to ask that in the future, the state looks at doing business with folks, that we do business with people who are capable of getting it done, and reputable people to do that. And especially with the interest rates and their bond rating, it just makes no sense why would even deal with anybody with a BBB- bond rating. That floors me. But thank you very much for what you do, and you have been open and forthright with it, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Representative Cherry, then Representative Senator Taylor.
I too like to thank both of you and the teamwork you put together to do something that's pretty difficult, and the resolution seems to be happening. I think time is money, and saving the time, it will be money down the road, and you've negotiated very well on behalf of the state of Indiana. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Senator Taylor.
Just from the standpoint of someone who does this for a profession, I'd like to first of all say that doing a P3 transaction was new when we did it, which causes some of the situations that we see that come up that you can't anticipate. The second piece of it is the people that they did business with did not have a triple B minus rating when we did business with them. They were downgraded to that. That's important to understand because when the transaction was bid, there were 3 finalists. We chose the less expensive route. It was clearly less expensive, I believe, by over $100 million. I don't want to quote
Approximately 70 million.
70.
You're close.
But that being said, we were being fiscally conservative, but maybe not P3 conservative, if you will, experience. So this was a situation where we did not come out with a road that was built, but what we did come out with was the ability to get the project back and save the taxpayers money, which I think is still a positive. So I just want to make sure this process was kind of like learning along the way, and I think Dan and his office did a great job. Well, let's go back. Dan kind of picked it up, but there were other people involved when this started. Kendra York, the other people who were over at the IFA when this started, and I think they did a really good job at protecting our interests just in case this did happen. So I just wanted to make it clear that, we didn't start out doing business with a triple B minus rating company. It just happened to get that way after they filed bankruptcy.
Senator Talion.
Thank you. Sorry, last 2 straggling questions. So what's the total amount of your bond issue going to be?
I think that's going to be determined. It will definitely cover replacing the private activity bonds. NDOT and IFA need to come back and work on what the cost to complete is and determine what that's going to be.
All right, so it's 240 plus the cost to complete.
That is the plan right now.
All right, and then my other question is this. I want to go back to those performance bonds.
I should have said, it will probably still likely be close to 240. It's just there is there will continue to be as we do reviews and get in there itself with NDOT. There could be some minor changes, but we're not talking large material differences. Dan, is that?
Well, I think we're talking about taking out the private activity bonds as one part of it. And then after the analysis by NDOT and IFA and determining the best payment process, we could see that bond issue, move slightly because of that.
Okay, and my other question has to do with the surety bonds, because we talked about this in a summer study committee a year ago or 2 years ago, I can't remember, but was this one of the projects that was bonded at like 15%?
There was a payment bond at 15% and then a performance bond at 25%. So 75 million on the performance bond and 15 million on the payment bond.
And just so going forward, I think one of the things that we talked about in that committee was requiring these to be 100% bonded like most of the other NDOT projects are, right? Doesn't NDOT require 100% bonding?
I'm not sure about the bonding. Do you know, Jim?
On the normal NDOT projects, yes, there's
Yeah.
payment bond.
Performance bond, right.
And we've been talking with a lot of the surety companies regarding your comments, and they're very open to discussing at what level we all feel would be really good for P3s for the future.
Yeah.
One statement on that I think is a little bit that may only be applicable here. I don't want to make a blanket statement, but at least in this case, there were not any claims made against the performance bond. Am I right on that, Dan?
At this stage, that's
At this
correct.
stage, is that fair, Jim?
Performance bond.
Yeah. So at least as it stands today on this project, a higher amount there wouldn't have materially changed where we are. Now, I'm not making that as a blanket statement. I'm making that as a statement where we
But
are
a
right
higher
now.
amount on the completion bond might have gotten us a payment higher than 50 million bucks, right?
That could be taken into
Potentially.
consideration, yes.
I hate to argue from a more liberal position than you, Senator Talion.
Write that down.
Now we're having fun.
But I think that the point you raise is a good point, and available for a legitimate discussion, but I think it is a debatable proposition that you should have a 100% performance bond. So we'll leave that for the future to discern. Since you'll be here, I'm sure you'll have an opportunity to file bills. And so we have a full explanation here. Are there any motions to remove items from the agenda as amended, or, well, it wasn't amended, so remove any items from the agenda? And if not, I will entertain a motion to formally adopt the approved agenda.
So moved.
Been moved and seconded that we adopt the agenda. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Thank you all for coming on July the 6th.